Hey everybody, Adam from Atlas Gunworks. We're going to talk about recoil springs today and pretty much all aspects. So there's two big components here. One is tuning them to make sure that they're in the gun properly. They're not always a drop-in part. They can be, but they're not always. And the second is, how do we mess with these things for recoil purposes, right? The equation is this. The gun's geometry, so where the weight is in the gun, the physics of the gun recoiling, how long the slide is, what spring's in there. Well, we'll come back to the spring. So my grip pressure, the ammo power, all of this is an equation that the one thing we can adjust really easily is the recoil spring. So how much resistance for that cycle to happen. And so just think about it like this. If the gun lifts, if the gun does this and comes back and lands right where I want it to, then I have the right spring. If it dives a little bit, I want to spring down if I can. You can't always. And if it returns and is high instead of level, then I need more spring. And there's this balance, and there's a million factors in this, but the springs can control a lot of that. So there's a tuning window for each caliber, and a generically 9mm, somewhere between 7 and 11 pounds, and 40 caliber. It's really hard to go much below 10 pounds, and you can go all the way up to 13, so a little narrower window. 40 is very snappy, so we gotta mitigate that immediate oomph from the gun wanting to unlock and have a lot of velocity in the beginning of that cycle. So let's look at this Athena we have here, 9mm. I've got my clippers in case I need them. I've got two different springs that aren't going to work in this gun, I don't think. So we're going to go through that process and see how we would put a new spring, a replacement spring in a gun. And the replacement spring could be because you need to. I think we're saying 5,000 to 10,000 rounds these days for changing recoil springs. Honestly, the old school way is you could kind of just tell when they weren't doing what they used to, but to be fair, if you change them every 5K, you should be good. So this gun has a new Atlas toolless guide rod with a new reverse plug setup. It's the design engineer guys here did a great job. That's a much improved design over the previous options. Oh, don't even need to take my barrel out. So first thing we're gonna do, if your recoil spring is too long, what will happen is it will push this. So when you do the gun, we'll see if I'm strong enough to do this. It'll stop like right here. And what that does is it puts all the pressure on this reverse plug, and it will eventually crack out the front of this housing, and the reverse plug will shoot out of the gun. Or the spring will shoot out of the reverse plug. And I've seen that happen on the range. And some spring manufacturers will sell a 5-inch spring, and it will be too long for your gun and your setup. It's probably any gun, but I'm trying to be a little bit kind. So you have to check the length. So every time you get a new spring in your gun, this is the procedure. We're gonna put the reverse plug on here. Super helps when we have a toolless guide rod. We can do this out of the gun, but it's better to do it in the gun. So reverse plug in, everything looks good. And when I put the reverse plug in, I want to make sure that it's not sticking out here and that we're just inside the slide here. All that looks good on this gun. I'm going to push forward, and I want to make sure, now I have a shock buff on here. We don't have to have a shock buff, right? But whether there's a shock buff or no shock buff, the shock buff, if it's there, needs to touch. If not, it needs to be the end of the guide rod. But I need to be able to touch here. That means that we're not limiting our overall travel on the stacking. As a spring gets tighter and tighter, it stacks. Because if we stop on the spring, it will break. It will eventually break parts. Potentially this part and potentially your reverse plug. So there's my 4.6-inch spring. We color code them now at Atlas. Just for reference, here is also a blue spring, but a 5-inch blue spring. We're about to do this test, and I would I would bet that it will fail the test, but let's hope it does for demonstration's sake here. All right. Well, you'll know on this one, I've never done this with this 4.6-inch guide rod setup. Oh, maybe it'll work without the buffer. We'll try. But at this point, the thing stacks so tight or so high that we can't even get the reverse plug onto the gun all the way to hit the button on the Atlas. Oh, here we go. So there we do, right? So I put this in the gun, and now boom, I'm stocking. It's called coil binding, but you're stopping on the actual spring. That will break things fast. And the gun will short stroke by this amount. Gun might not even run in this case. So let's say let's say that's the only spring I got. I'm on the range. You're like, oh, damn. All you need is your clippers. I'm gonna cheat and cut it off at the length I kind of know is gonna work. Actually, I'll cut it off a little bit long. Like our Weehaw clippers, those things work great. I'm gonna put the buffer back in because we're trying to mimic the real life scenario here. We like shock buffs. If you do, great. If you don't, take them out. It's not the end of the world. They are nice insurance if you have an overpressure situation. That's the #1 thing about them, but they do slightly change the impulse of the guns, the recoil impulse. All right, here we go. Perfect. See that little gap? You can see right here, this isn't touching, right? That's coil bind just the same as the big stack. It's gonna come later in the cycle and have a little less impact, but that will eventually break your, that will for sure break your reverse plug at some point, and we hope it does, because if it doesn't, it's putting all that stress on the front of the slide and it'll break the slide, it'll crack the slide right here. I've never seen one do that, but it in theory could. Okay, so you do that scenario. That sucks. I'm gonna guess, because I've done this a whole bunch, that was almost 2 coils. Okay. All right, so another thing we need to talk about on tuning. I just cut that. That's pretty sharp. Sharp stuff in guns is bad. Any sharp metal is bad, right? Whether it's guns or anywhere else. So normally we would put that on a wheel or a little file or something and just dull out the tip of that. Here we use a blue Scotch-Brite wheels, and you just tap them on there and it's nice and smooth and life's good. Boom, goes all the way, life's good. All right, so that's a tuned spring. We like that, it's good. For reference, I cut this many coils off a 5-inch spring. But now it's a 4.6-inch spring, it can work. So we can do that all the way down to a 4 1/4, it doesn't matter. There is a weird exception to that rule. So the weird exception is variable springs. So here's a variable spring. How does this, what is a variable spring and how is it different? I'm trying to hold this somewhere where we can kind of see with a background. Conventional spring, probably best on the black. Coils evenly spaced the whole way. Variable spring, coils get tighter towards the forward end. So this is the end of the muzzle, tighter coils. Gives you a different recoil impulse. You can totally ignore this or do all the testing you want, but my experience is that the variable springs I just don't like. I've never seen a scenario in my own testing where these are better. And mostly it's recoil impulse to me. It's not function of the gun at all. So I would just skip the variables, and if you sort of shoot like we shoot and believe most of the concepts we believe in, you can skip a lot of time and money and just skip the variable spring. But it's a thing, people do it. I'm not against it. But if you start cutting back on a variable, we're gonna lose the variable coils. And that's a third parameter, right? So now take a 5-inch variable and cut it back to 4.6, and we only have 3 variables. Is that better? I don't know. But our testing says conventional springs work great. And so I'm gonna wrap this video up by just reiterating what we're talking about. But buy premium springs, buy them from good manufacturers. The springs are not all created equal. It is an 80-cent part from most, cost on most people. I know they charge you $8 or $9 or $10 for them, but they're 80 cents. So nobody's checking every single one. So also, the last thing I'll say to you is get a gauge. We sell gauge packs. Test the gauge. Just because it's a blue one from Atlas or in a 9-pound bag from one of the other manufacturers, it doesn't matter. Make sure you test them, then tune them and check the length, and then life's good. Hope to see you on the range soon.